Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, by Tom Holland. Introduction. Imagine standing on the bank of a small, insignificant stream on a bitter winter night. The sun has long set behind the mountains. Behind you, an army of soldiers, men who have followed you for 8 bloody years to the very edges of the known world, stand silent, waiting. They are hardened, loyal, and ready to die for you. Ahead of you, across that narrow stream, lies home. Italy. The road to Rome. But there's a problem. A law, stern and ancient, forbids you from crossing that stream with your army. To do so is more than just breaking a rule, it's an act of treason. It is a declaration of civil war against your own people. Your enemies in the capital, jealous of your success and fearful of your power, have backed you into a corner. You have a choice. You can surrender your command, give up everything you've built, and face the ruin of your career, becoming a forgotten footnote in history. Or, you can cross the stream. This was the moment that faced Gaius Julius Caesar on January 10, 49 BC, as he stared into the dark, swirling waters of a little river called the Rubicon. It was a moment the Romans had a word for: discrimin. A point of agonizing tension, where an entire lifetime, and perhaps the fate of the world, hangs in the balance. In his masterful book, Rubicon, historian Tom Holland takes us not just to that riverbank, but deep into the heart of the society that produced it. He tells the story of the final 100 years of the Roman Republic, a period of unparalleled triumph and unimaginable violence, a time of giants like Caesar, Pompey, Cicero, and Cleopatra. This isn't just a dry history lesson. This is the story of how a civilization that prided itself on liberty, on being a republic free from kings, ended up destroying itself in the pursuit of power and glory. It's the story of how ambition, wealth, and empire can stretch a society to its breaking point. And here is my promise to you: by the end of our time together, you will understand the deep, timeless patterns that led to the fall of Rome. You'll see how a society built on competition can sow the seeds of its own destruction, and how the echoes of their struggle, the clash between freedom and order, between personal ambition and the common good, still reverberate in our world, in our politics, and even in our own lives today. This is more than a story about ancient men in togas. It's a mirror held up to the enduring challenges of power itself. Book summary. So, how does a republic die? How does a nation built on the idea of shared power, of freedom from the rule of a single man, end up with an emperor? To understand the fall of the Roman Republic, we first have to understand what it was. And what it was, above all, was a paradox. Picture Rome not as the majestic marble city we see in movies, but as it was for most of its history, a chaotic, sprawling, and often squalid place. It was a city, Tom Holland tells us, that was both a building site and a junkyard. The Romans were deeply conservative. They revered tradition and the ways of their ancestors. Yet, they were also relentlessly pragmatic. They kept what worked, adapted what failed, and built their future right on top of the jumbled ruins of their past. This paradoxical spirit was the very essence of the Republic. Its citizens defined themselves not as subjects of a king, but as free men. Their identity was forged in competition. Life was a constant struggle for honestas, a word that meant both moral excellence and public reputation. You were only as good as your fellow citizens said you were. This created a ferocious, gnawing hunger for glory in every Roman heart. It was a hunger that drove them to conquer their neighbors, then Italy, and then, with breathtaking speed, the entire Mediterranean world. The Romans believed their freedom was the engine of this success. As Holland puts it, it is almost beyond belief how great the Republic's achievements were once the people had gained their liberty. Such was the longing for glory which it lit in every man's heart. But this system had a fatal flaw, a crack in its very foundation. While the citizens of the Republic were taught to temper their competitive instincts for the good of the community at home, no such rules applied when dealing with outsiders. Their way of war was uniquely lethal. When they took a city by storm, it was their practice to slaughter every living thing, man, woman, child, and even animal, not in a savage frenzy, but as a disciplined act of terror. This ruthlessness, this insatiable greed for praise and glory, brought them an empire. And the empire, in turn, began to poison the republic that had won it. The first tremors of the earthquake to come were felt with two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were aristocrats of impeccable breeding, but they saw the sickness spreading through Roman society. The vast wealth pouring in from conquered lands was being concentrated in the hands of a few, while the small farmers who had been the backbone of the legions were being driven from their land, flooding into the slums of Rome. In 133 BC, and then again a decade later, the Gracchi brothers used their office as tribunes, protectors of the people, to push for radical reforms. They proposed giving public land back to the poor and selling them grain at a subsidized rate. To the wealthy aristocracy, this was not just an attack on their profits, it was an act of treason against the established order. They saw the Gracchi not as reformers, but as demagogues aiming to become tyrants. And so, for the first time since the expulsion of the kings 4 centuries earlier, political blood was spilled in the streets of Rome. Tiberius Gracchus was clubbed to death with a stool leg. 12 years later, his brother Gaius was also killed by agents of the aristocracy. His head was cut off, filled with molten lead, and presented for a bounty. The murders of the Gracchi were a terrible turning point. They proved that any attempt at fundamental reform would be seen as a play for absolute power, and that violence was now an acceptable tool in politics. The old rules were breaking down. A dangerous precedent had been set. If the Gracchi opened the door to political violence, the two men who kicked it wide open were Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was what the Romans called a new man. He wasn't from one of the old noble families. He was a tough, brilliant soldier from the countryside who rose to the very top on raw ability alone. He reformed the army, opening its ranks to the landless poor for the first time. This was a necessary change, but it had a profound and dangerous consequence. From this point on, soldiers' loyalty would belong not to the state, but to the general who paid them, who led them to victory, and who promised them a plot of land for their retirement. The Roman legions were slowly turning into private armies. Sulla was everything Marius was not. He was a patrician from an old but impoverished family, a man of decadent tastes and icy cruelty. He first served under Marius, and the two men developed a bitter rivalry that would eventually consume the Republic. Their feud represented the clash of two different kinds of ambition: Marius, the outsider clawing his way up, and Sulla, the aristocrat determined to restore the old order, no matter the cost. The breaking point came over who would command the war against a formidable enemy in the east, a king named Mithridates. The command promised immense glory and wealth. When Marius used political maneuvering to snatch the command from Sulla, who was consul at the time, Sulla did the unthinkable. He turned his army around and marched on Rome. It was a moment of shocking sacrilege. No Roman general had ever led legions against their own city. The act itself was a declaration that his personal honor mattered more than the ancient laws of the Republic. He took the city, had his enemies declared outlaws, and then, after settling affairs, went off to fight Mithridates. But the cycle of violence had only just begun. While Sulla was away, Marius returned. With his own faction, he launched a brutal purge of Sulla's supporters. The heads of senators were displayed on pikes in the Forum. Marius finally achieved his long-prophesied 7th consulship, but he died only a few days into it, a man consumed by bitterness and rage. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC, victorious and battle-hardened, he was determined to have his revenge. The civil war that followed was horrific. For the first time, Romans systematically hunted and killed other Romans on a massive scale. Sulla emerged as the absolute master of Rome. He declared himself dictator, an ancient emergency office, but he held it not for a few months, but indefinitely. He then unleashed the proscriptions. Lists of his enemies were posted in the forum, and anyone on the list could be killed for a reward. It was a reign of terror that saw thousands murdered and their property confiscated. Sulla used this bloodshed to reshape the state, strengthening the Senate and crippling the office of the tribunes, the very position the Gracchi had used to challenge the elite. He was trying to turn back the clock, to restore the Republic to what he believed it should be. And then, having remade the state in his own image, he did something even more shocking than marching on Rome. He voluntarily gave up his power. He retired to his villa to live out his days in decadent leisure. Sulla had hoped to save the Republic from itself. But what he had really done was provide a terrifying blueprint for its destruction. He had shown that a man with a loyal army could impose his will on the state. He had demonstrated that political rivalry could escalate to mass murder. The question that would hang over the next generation was a simple and terrifying one: Sulla could do it. Why can't I? Into this broken world, a new generation of ambitious men emerged, shaped by the violence and cynicism of the civil wars. And three of them stood above all others: Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Gnaeus Pompeius, known as Pompey the Great, was a military prodigy. He had raised a private army for Sulla while still a teenager, earning the nickname the Teenage Butcher. He had a genius for war and an even greater genius for self-promotion. He styled himself as a new Alexander the Great, and the Roman people adored him. He was their hero, a man who seemed to win victories effortlessly. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome. His fortune was built on shrewd, and often ruthless, business dealings during Sulla's proscriptions. He understood, more than anyone, that in the new Rome, money was power. He operated in the shadows, a master manipulator, extending his influence through a vast web of debt and obligation. And then there was Gaius Julius Caesar. A patrician from one of Rome's oldest families? They claimed descent from the goddess Venus? Caesar possessed a lethal combination of charm, brilliance, and boundless ambition. As a young man, his family connections to Marius had made him a target of Sulla, forcing him into hiding. The experience taught him to be ruthless and to trust only in himself. These three men were ferocious rivals. Yet, in 60 BC, they did something unprecedented. They decided that the political system, with its checks and balances, was an obstacle to their ambitions. So, they formed a secret pact to pool their resources and carve up the state between them. This alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, was not a formal office. It was a private gentleman's agreement to subvert the Republic. As Holland writes, it was effectively a three-headed monster. Pompey wanted his military settlements in the east ratified and land for his veterans. Crassus wanted a lucrative military command to match Pompey's glory. And Caesar, the most junior partner, wanted the consulship, followed by a long-term command in Gaul. They got everything they wanted. Caesar became consul in 59 BC and, using a mixture of bribery, intimidation, and Pompey's veterans, he rammed through the triumvirate's agenda, completely ignoring the opposition of the Senate. His co-consul, a man named Bibulus, was so intimidated that he locked himself in his house for the rest of the year, effectively leaving Caesar as the sole ruler of Rome. Having secured his goals, Caesar then departed for his command in Gaul. For the next 9 years, while Pompey and Crassus bickered in Rome, Caesar was engaged in one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. He conquered all of Gaul, modern-day France, a land of fierce warrior tribes. He crossed the Rhine into Germany and even launched 2 expeditions to the mysterious island of Britain. But this was more than just a series of conquests. In Gaul, Caesar was forging something far more valuable than territory: a massive, battle-hardened army, whose soldiers were fanatically loyal to him personally. He also amassed a staggering personal fortune from plunder, which he used to buy political support back in Rome. He was building his power base, preparing for the day when he would return. Back in Rome, the triumvirate was falling apart. Crassus, finally getting his wish for military glory, launched an ill-advised invasion of Parthia, a powerful kingdom in the east. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, his army was annihilated, and Crassus himself was killed. The story goes that the Parthians, knowing his reputation for greed, poured molten gold down his throat. With Crassus gone, there were only 2 giants left, Pompey and Caesar. And the Republic was not big enough for both of them. Pompey, who had remained in Rome, watched Caesar's spectacular success in Gaul with growing alarm. The man he had once considered his junior partner was now becoming his equal, perhaps even his superior. The traditionalist faction in the Senate, led by the stoic and unbending Cato the Younger, saw their chance. They began to court Pompey, seeing him as the only man who could stand against Caesar's ambition. They painted Caesar as a dangerous radical, a would-be tyrant who would destroy the Republic. The Senate demanded that Caesar give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for the consulship. But Caesar knew what that meant. Without the legal immunity of his command, his enemies would immediately prosecute him for his illegal acts during his first consulship. Conviction would mean the end of his career. He offered a compromise: let both he and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously. Pompey, now allied with the Senate, refused. The deadlock was complete. And so we return to that riverbank in the winter of 49 BC. Caesar had been pushed into a corner. Before him lay the Rubicon. To cross it meant civil war. To turn back meant ruin. He hesitated, tormented by the sheer magnitude of the decision. The achievements of a lifetime hung in the balance. But then, as Holland vividly describes, he made up his mind, as if in a gambler's fit of passion. "The die is cast," he said, and gave the order to advance. The civil war that followed tore the Roman world apart. It was not a war of ideologies, but a clash of 2 colossal ambitions. Pompey had the backing of the Senate and the resources of the East. Caesar had his veteran legions from Gaul and a reputation for lightning speed. Instead of waiting for Pompey to assemble his full strength, Caesar launched a blitzkrieg through Italy. Town after town opened its gates to him. Pompey and the Senate, caught completely off guard, were forced to abandon Rome and flee across the sea to Greece. Caesar had won Italy without a major battle, but the war was far from over. He first secured his position by defeating Pompey's armies in Spain, and then, in 48 BC, he followed Pompey to Greece. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar, despite being heavily outnumbered, won a decisive victory. His tactical genius was on full display. He famously ordered his men not to throw their javelins, but to use them as spears aimed at the faces of Pompey's cavalry, knowing that the young noblemen would rather flee than risk having their handsome faces scarred. Pompey fled the battlefield, a broken man. He sought refuge in Egypt, but the advisors to the young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, decided it was safer to curry favor with the winner. As Pompey stepped ashore, he was stabbed to death. His severed head was presented to Caesar when he arrived a few days later. Caesar, far from being pleased, wept. He had wanted to defeat his rival, not see him murdered so ignominiously. But now, with Pompey dead, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. What followed was a whirlwind. Caesar was trapped in Alexandria for months, caught up in a local power struggle. It was here that he met the young queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. She was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly captivating. They became lovers, and she bore him a son, Caesarion. After finally leaving Egypt, Caesar mopped up the remaining pockets of Pompeian resistance, in Asia Minor, where he won a battle so quickly he summed it up in the famous phrase, "I came, I saw, I conquered," in Africa, where Cato and the other die-hard Republicans had regrouped, and finally in Spain, where Pompey's sons made a final stand. By 45 BC, the Civil War was finally over. Caesar returned to Rome, not just a victorious general, but something new and unsettling. The Senate, desperate to appease him, showered him with unprecedented honors. He was made consul for 10 years, then dictator for life. His statue was placed in the temples among the gods. Caesar was a whirlwind of reform. He revised the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that we still use, with minor modifications, today. He planned vast building projects to transform Rome. He extended citizenship to people in the provinces. He was trying to heal a broken world. But for all his genius, he failed to solve the fundamental problem. What was his own position in the state? He was a king in all but name, and the title of king was something the Romans despised with an almost pathological hatred. Caesar seemed to scorn the traditions of the Republic. He treated the Senate with disdain. He seemed to believe he was above the law. A conspiracy began to form against him, a group of senators who believed he was a tyrant who had to be removed to restore liberty. The tragedy was that many of the conspirators were not his old enemies, but men he considered his friends, men he had pardoned and promoted. The leaders were Cassius, a former Pompeian, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar loved like a son. On the Ides of March, March 15, 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate House. The conspirators crowded around him, pretending to present a petition. Then, they drew daggers hidden beneath their togas and stabbed him to death. He fell at the foot of a statue of his great rival, Pompey. The assassins declared that liberty had been restored. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had killed the tyrant, but they had not killed his legacy. And they had no plan for what came next. The murder of Caesar did not restore the Republic, it plunged the Roman world into another, even more terrible, round of civil war. 3 men emerged to fill the power vacuum. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal and hard-living deputy. Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals. And a surprising new player, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, a sickly but ruthlessly intelligent teenager named Gaius Octavius, whom we know as Octavian. These 3 formed a second triumvirate. Unlike the first, this was a formal, legal dictatorship. Their first act was to launch a new wave of proscriptions, even more brutal than Sulla's. They needed money to pay their armies, and they had scores to settle. Their most famous victim was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic. Antony had long hated him. Cicero's head and hands were cut off and nailed to the rostra in the Forum, a gruesome symbol that the age of free speech was over. The triumvirs then hunted down Caesar's assassins. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, the armies of Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Both men committed suicide. With them died the last, best hope of the old Republic. But the world was still not at peace. The second triumvirate, like the first, soon fell apart. Lepidus was sidelined. The Roman world was divided between 2 masters, Antony in the east, and Octavian in the west. Antony went native. He set up his court in Alexandria and resumed Caesar's affair with Cleopatra. Together, they ruled the East like Hellenistic monarchs, dreaming of a new kind of empire, a fusion of Roman and Greek, with Alexandria as its capital. They had children and declared them the rulers of vast territories. Back in Rome, Octavian skillfully used this as propaganda. He portrayed Antony as a decadent traitor, a slave to a foreign queen, who planned to move the capital of the empire away from Rome. He cast himself as the champion of Roman tradition, of Italy, of the old ways. The final showdown came in 31 BC at the naval battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated. They fled back to Egypt. A year later, as Octavian's legions closed in on Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. At the age of 32, Octavian, the boy who had inherited nothing but a name, was the sole, undisputed master of the entire Roman world. The civil wars were over. After a century of chaos and bloodshed, peace had finally come. But the Republic was dead. Octavian was too clever to call himself a king or a dictator. He knew the Romans would never accept that. So, he performed a masterpiece of political theater. In 27 BC, he went before the Senate and announced that he was restoring the Republic. He was handing all his powers back to the Senate and the people of Rome. The grateful senators, terrified of a return to anarchy, begged him to stay. They persuaded him to accept control of the most important provinces and armies. They gave him a new name, one that was sacred and venerable: Augustus. It was a brilliant fiction. Augustus claimed to be merely the first citizen, the princeps, ruling in partnership with the Senate. In reality, all the power was in his hands. He controlled the army, the treasury, and the levers of government. The old republican institutions, the assemblies, the consulships, continued to exist, but they were a hollow shell. The Romans, exhausted by war and grateful for peace and stability, accepted this new order. They had traded their liberty for security. The Republic, with its fierce competition, its glorious triumphs, and its catastrophic tragedies, was over. The Roman Empire had begun. Commentary. So what do we take from this incredible, sprawling, and often brutal story? Why does the fall of the Roman Republic, an event that happened over 2,000 years ago, still hold such a powerful grip on our imagination? I think it's because, at its core, Rubicon isn't just a story about Rome. It's a story about the inherent tensions in any society that values both individual greatness and collective stability. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition is untethered from responsibility. The Romans, as Tom Holland so brilliantly illustrates, believed that competition was the essence of life. The drive to be the best, to win glory, to have your name remembered forever, this was what made you a Roman. And for centuries, this very drive fueled their astonishing success. It created a society of immense dynamism and resilience. But the story of the Republic's fall is the story of that strength turning into a fatal weakness. As Rome's empire grew, the prizes for success became astronomically large. A command in the East wasn't just about glory anymore. It was about acquiring a fortune that could buy elections, fund private armies, and make a man more powerful than the state itself. The system that was designed to channel ambition for the public good became a system that rewarded those who were willing to destroy the public good for their own ambition. Men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar weren't necessarily evil. They were, in many ways, the ultimate products of the Roman system. They were just playing the game with higher stakes and fewer rules than ever before. They were men of genius, courage, and incredible drive. But their greatness became so immense that the Republic itself could no longer contain it. They became like stars so massive that they collapse into black holes, pulling the entire system in with them. And that, I believe, is the most profound lesson for us today. We live in a world that celebrates ambition. We're told to dream big, to disrupt, to change the world. And that's a powerful and wonderful thing. But Rubicon reminds us that there's a dark side to that relentless drive. It asks us to consider the systems we operate in. Are they healthy? Do they reward cooperation as much as they reward competition? Do they have checks and balances strong enough to contain the ambitions of the most powerful players? When a society's institutions weaken, when norms of behavior are shattered, and when winning becomes the only thing that matters, it creates a dangerous vacuum. The story of Rome shows us that in such a vacuum, the most ruthless, not necessarily the best, will rise. And it shows us that people, when faced with chaos and instability, will often willingly trade their freedom for the promise of order. That is the tragic bargain that ended the Republic and gave birth to the Empire. So, what can a young, ambitious person like you take from this? First, understand the game you're playing. Whether it's in your school, your future career, or your community, pay attention to the unspoken rules and the underlying systems. A system that encourages a winner-take-all mentality can be a dangerous one. Second, think about the nature of your own ambition. Striving for greatness is a noble pursuit. But greatness at what cost? Caesar conquered Gaul and became one of the most famous men in history, but his ambition led to the death of 1 million people and the end of his country's freedom. Real leadership, the kind that endures, isn't just about achieving personal glory. It's about building something that lasts, something that serves a purpose larger than yourself. Finally, don't underestimate the power of character and tradition. The men who tried to save the Republic, like Cato and Cicero, ultimately failed. But they failed while holding on to their principles. They understood that some things are more important than winning. In a world that often seems cynical and chaotic, holding on to a moral compass, understanding the value of institutions, and acting with integrity, these are not signs of weakness. They are the foundations of true and lasting strength. That was a summary of Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic by Tom Holland. We've journeyed through the highlights today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you explore the territory yourself. The true magic of this book is in Holland's masterful storytelling, the way he brings these ancient figures to life until you feel their ambition, their fear, and their humanity. This summary is designed to help you decide if this story is one you want to experience firsthand. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about power, ambition, and the world we live in. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey into the past valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these stories matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.